Hey, Graceway, Pastor Tim here, hoping that you had a great Christmas and New Year. And I want to just take a couple minutes now with a little bit of time to reflect and think and pray and write. Just talk to you about the year that was and my thoughts on it, and talk to you about our plans for 2021 so you can plan accordingly. So I came actually into the church building December 31st, late afternoon. I was the only one in the building, and I did two things. I walked around this auditorium praying for the year that was to come, trying to get my bearings on the year that was. And I actually got into my truck and I drove around our property over and over and over again. And my aim in that was just to get some closure, get some vision, get some perspective on the year that was and on the year that was to come. And so I cranked up that worship music, and as I drove around our property, just said, God, could you just talk to me about the year that has been? Can you talk to me about your plans for the year that is to come? Do it for me and do it for this incredible congregation that I get to lead. And as I was driving around our property over and over and over again, God brought to mind one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's of a guy by the name of Caleb. Caleb was one of the first two spies that went into the promised land after God had led his people out of Egypt, out of bondage, and into freedom towards his plans and purposes for them. He brought them through the wilderness, and they came right up to the edge of the promised land, and there was 12 spies that went in. 12 spies who went in to lay claim visually to the plans that God had for his people. 10 of those spies came home and said, nope, God couldn't do that. God's not doing that. They're too big. It's too scary. We can't go. 2 of the spies came back and said, God said we can, and we're going. One of them, his name was Joshua. There's a book in the Bible kind of dedicated to his story. He followed Moses. The second was my man Caleb. And Caleb was one of these men who believed that God was up to something even when other people didn't. Even when it looked like he wasn't, Caleb laid hold to the promises of God. If you read the story of Caleb, you know that his belief persisted. And even though the people of Israel many, many years later would ultimately lay claim to the promised land, that Caleb remained faithful to what God said. And one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible is when Caleb, now an old man, goes to the leadership of Israel and says, I know I'm old. I know it's been a long time. I know a lot of you have forgotten what God did. I know that this felt like a loss and a disappointment and a disaster, but I want what God promised me. I'm old, but I'm not that old. I've been disappointed. I've been discouraged, but I'm here to reclaim what God was doing. And in that moment, as I listened to that worship music and prayed and thought and considered, I realized that it was applicable to what 2020 has been. It's been a year of disappointment and of discouragement and of tension and of disagreement and of loss. And I think sometimes whenever we lose something, we assume that it has to stay lost. We assume that we missed out. We assume that there's no getting it back. Caleb rejected that idea. He believed that things that had been lost, things that had been missed, could be reclaimed. And so I said to God, in 2021, I want you to give me and give our church everything that we feel like we lost in 2020 with interest. I want it all. I want it back. I want the experiences. I want the transformation. I want the moments. I want the conversations. I want the relationships. I reject the idea that the losses that we experience in 2020 are final. And so in 2021, I'm aiming at reclamation, and I'm asking you to do that with me. Obviously, I want you to learn what you needed to learn and consider what you needed to consider, but there's some things that we can lean back into together. There's some beliefs, some faith, some holding to the promises of God, that the things that we feel like we lost are just delayed, and that we can reclaim what God has been doing, will do, promise to do, and that we can do it together. And so if you feel like you've had distance in relationships, if you feel like you've had conflict, if you feel like you've had disappointments and discouragements, what I'm asking you to do is have a spirit of reclamation in 2021 and lean back into those things. And as we come back into the building and as we restart the gathering of God's people in this church called Graceway, us having a belief that what was lost doesn't mean it's permanent, and that what was discouraging, what was disappointing, that what has been divided, that the disagreements that we've had are just lessons that we've learned, but that God still has incredible things for us, and we want them together with interest. One of the things that I'm anxious to reclaim is just our worship services. I have missed it incredibly, missed being in this room with you, missed worshiping Jesus with you, missed hearing from God with you, miss seeing you, miss hugging you, miss just being together. And so I wanted you to know what our plan is in 2021. As of this Sunday, which is January 10th, we are going to begin to meet every other week for English services and on the off week for our Spanish services. January 10th, we will meet 2 services for English services at 9 and 10:30. January 17th, the Spanish community will have 1 service, and we will stagger that every other week through the month of February. In March, our plan is to begin to meet in person, still socially distanced, and still with masks every single week. 2 services a week as we did pre-COVID. Our Spanish community will do the same. And we are asking God to immediately meet us in our gathering, to reclaim that same spirit, that same momentum, that same enjoyment that we had pre-COVID. And I'm asking you to lean into that with me. I'm believing that God has things that he planted in 2020, even though some of them felt like losses, that are still available to be reclaimed. And I'm asking you to show up here. I'm asking you to lean into things that we disagreed on, things that we were divided on, things that were discouraging, things that were disappointing, in the belief that God still has them for us and that we can receive them together in 2021. I want to thank you for your faithfulness, for your kindness, for your patience in 2020. I know that it has been difficult. I know that some of you haven't agreed with all the decisions that I've made. Maybe at some point we can have a conversation around that, but I want you to know that I love you. I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I want you to know that I'm excited to move forward together, and that I believe that it wasn't a lost year. It's just a delayed year, and that this is the year, and that in the years to come, we will see new fruit and new grace and new wind and new momentum and new revelation, and God's goodness will prevail, and we'll be able to receive it together. I love you. I'm praying for you. Can't wait to see you in person. I hope that you're having a great week, and by God's grace, I'll see you soon.